Hello, I'm Chris with Digital Tutors, an Adobe authorized training partner. In this series of lessons, we'll learn how to composite a text title into background footage. This is a common task for show openers or to add extra information into your shot. We'll begin this project by importing our background plate and creating the text we'll integrate. Then we'll track the background plate and attach our text to the track. We'll then learn about the uses of pre-composing and how to combine various effects to make our text look three-dimensional. We'll then learn how to take effects from our background and layer them onto our text to create the illusion that the text is in the scene. We'll finish by doing a quick color correction and render out our finished shot. This series of lessons shows how After Effects can be used to composite text into your footage. This will allow us to integrate and composite text into our scenes quickly and with higher realism and visual appeal. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. In this first lesson, we're going to bring in our background footage and set up all of our initial compositions. So I've just opened up a new project inside of After Effects here, and what we can do now is let's double click our project, and I'm just going to jump into my project files, and let's jump into the images folder, and inside we have a source footage folder, and let's just import this TIFF sequence here. Now this is the background footage that we're going to be creating or integrating our title into. Now if we double click this, we can take a look at this and play through. Now currently, if we look up here at our preview, we're set at 30 FPS, and this was actually shot at 24. So let's right click, let's go to interpret footage and the main interpret, and let's change our frame rate to 24 frames per second. Let's click OK here. That's going to change it so that it plays back at the correct speed. Now we have that, let's drag it onto a new composition, which will automatically size and time it correctly. So now we can hit the 0 key to create a RAM preview, or Shift 0 to create a RAM preview with every other frame. And here is the background footage that we're going to need to integrate our title into. Now for this course, I've downloaded a font off of the internet, so I've included a flat text PSD file that has the font and the text that I'm going to integrate inside of it. So we see here, this is the font, and you can of course find this at this website. And of course you can use any font and any text that you would like. This is just a font and some text that I decided looks nice inside of this project. So during this course I'm going to be actually using a text layer, but you can of course use this text.psd instead of our text layer. So I'm just going to remove this from my source footage here, and now we can pretty much come in and track our plate movement. So let's just grab our text tool here, either up here or hitting Control T, and let's drop in whatever text we're going to be integrating. So I'm going to be integrating something like volume 6 full trader. Of course you can use any, as I said before, any font and any text you would like. So now that we've got our text in here, we obviously want our text to move with our video here and have shadows cast on it as well. So the first part of getting this completed is creating an initial track to connect our text into our video movement. Now our video movement was actually shot to be rather simple. It's just pretty much a rotation, and it's a rather small amount of rotation. So we're going to be able to do this with a single one-point track. And this is going to simplify our lives very much. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at how to track this footage and then how to apply that motion to our text layer. In this lesson, we're going to track our footage using a one-point track and then take a look at how to connect this up to our text layers using a null and parenting. Now, if you want to learn more about tracking inside of After Effects, feel free to watch our course, Introduction to Tracking in After Effects. For now, let's just grab our source footage. Let's jump up to Animation, Track Motion, and now that'll bring up our tracker window here. Now the point is we need to track something that's on our screen the entire time and is also close to our text layer. So if we jump back to our composition window here, we can see this is where our text is, and I've just roughly placed it into position. So now let's go into our tracker again, or our layer, And let's choose a tracking point. Obviously, we want something that doesn't move but is visible throughout the entire sequence. So I'm going to look at these rocks here, and we can see that this rock right here is visible throughout the entire sequence. So let's just track a corner of this rock here. So I'm just going to drag my tracker over to this corner and analyze forward. You can find this tracker panel under Window, Tracker, if you accidentally close it. So now that that's done, we could of course apply this directly to our text layer. But instead of that, I'd rather apply it to a new null layer, and that lets me parent other layers to that null layer, and it also lets me keep my text layer clean. So to do this, let's go to Layer, New, Null Object, and I'm just going to give this a name, so I'm going to call this my tracking data. Of course, you can name this anything you would like. But let's now, in our tracker panel, go over to Edit Target, and let's choose our tracking data layer, which again is just our null, and hit Apply, and apply it in X and Y. And that's going to bounce us back into our composition panel here, so we can close our tracker. Now again, if your tracker goes like this, all you need to do is do the motion source back to your source footage. But now we have this null inside of our composition that moves with that stone. So now we just need to place our text in the initial position we want it at. And I'm just going to have this up a little bit, actually. And then all we need to do is take our text layer and parent it to our tracking data. Now, if you don't see this little lasso here, you can click this button down here. It's also pretty important that you go through the Getting Started with After Effects training before watching this course, because we are going to go over quite a few different things inside of After Effects, so having a primer to After Effects will help you out. So now that our parent of our text layer is this tracking data, we can see that this text layer now moves correctly with our footage. Now this works primarily because our footage movement is very simple and in a single axis. We're not translating our camera around, so we have very little perspective shifting. Now if you highly analyze this footage, you'll notice there's a little bit of perspective drift that we're not getting, which we'll get towards the end of this course. To see perspective drift, take a look at this pebble here and its relationship with the letter I. Now as we move forward, you'll notice the pebble is moving up into the letter I. And that tells me that there's some perspective shifting going on. But for the most part, we're going to be able to get away with this one-point track for most of our shot. So now that we have our text moving with our footage, let's now spend a little time to make our text a bit more attractive. So we'll begin doing that in the next lesson. So just to recap, in this lesson we took our source footage, went to Animate Motion, or Animation, Track Motion, then copied that tracking data to a null object, parented our text to it, and now we have our text moving with our footage. In this lesson we're going to learn how to pre-comp our text layer so that we can modify it later, and then we'll take a look at how we can create appealing 3D text effects using the Bevel Alpha effect. So here's where we left off, and I've just opened up 04_begin. So we have our text moving, but now we need to make it a little prettier. Now, before we begin editing our text, let's pre-comp it. So let's select our text layer. Let's either go up to Composition, and let's go to, instead of Composition, let's go to Layer, and let's go down to Pre-compose. I always forget where that is because I always use this Control-Shift-C shortcut. Now what pre-compose will do is it'll put it inside of a new composition. So let's just call this new comp our text. Let's click OK. And so now we have a text comp. Now you might be asking, why did we just do this? Well, what's going to happen is we're going to add a lot of effects onto our composition. And then we're going to duplicate this composition a few times to create the shadow and the text inside of the shadows. Now, the result of all that is we would have multiple separate text layers. So if we wanted to go back and change our text and change our font or size or location, we would have to go back and do that to multiple layers, making it very difficult and confusing. By pre-comping our text layer, we can still duplicate this pre-comp and apply many effects, but once we jump inside of here, we can edit the text, font, position, and anything else, and then these changes will apply to every other layer. So to see this in effect, let's now add in our effects, or let's now make this a little bit nicer. Before we do that, we should note that we did break our parenting, so we need to stay on the same frame and reparent our text pre-comp to this tracking data. And now that will reconnect our text to our position. So I want this text to be a slightly different color and a little bit different look. I want it to look slightly 3D. Now for the color, we could go into our text pre-comp, but since we're going to be overwriting this quite a few times, let's actually just create a fill effect on our text here. So with our text pre-comp selected inside of our main comp, and let's actually call our source footage our main comp just to make it easier. Let's go down to our text layer again, and let's add in a generate fill. And this is going to let us change the color of our text, so we can eyedropper this to somewhere on the ground here. And now let's click color, and let's just increase the brightness quite a bit here. And let's make this pretty bright. Okay, so I like that color, and of course we can always come back and change this later. So now let's add in the effect that's going to make it look 3D. Now this is looking essentially directly at our camera. Now you've probably heard from people, if you've ever tried to use the bevel alpha effect before, to never ever use the bevel alpha effect. And for the most part they're right. Most of the time, or 90% of the time I see this effect used, it's used incorrectly. So to take a look at what it looks like in the poor case or the bad case, let's select our text and go to Effect, Perspective, and drop on a bevel alpha. Now usually people come in here and say, oh, that's pretty cool. Let's see, to make it even more 3D, I can increase this edge thinning, and to make it look even deeper, I can increase this light intensity. And they get a result that looks essentially something like this. Now anyone who has ever seen a motion graphics piece has seen this effect, and they know it's coming. Now this does not actually look good at all. As you can see, if we zoom in, there are a ton of errors that appear with this bevel effect, and it just really does not work in any capacity. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply this bevel effect multiple times and in a very subtle manner. So the first thing let's do is let's change the light angle to move with where the current light is. So a good way to see where light is take a look at the shadows. So this looks like it's coming in this direction, so we just need to point our light angle in that direction. And now let's increase our edge thinning to the absolute maximum. And you can find that by looking at your text here and finding where these highlight and shadows hit each other. So it looks like in our case it's about 9. So let's set this to 9, and now let's set our light down extremely low. Let's set this down to something like 0.5. Now you might be saying, why do we even have this effect on here at all? At 0.5 you can barely even see it. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to duplicate this 6 times and change the size of it each time. So let's select our bevel alpha, let's hit Control D, and this time let's subtract 2 from our edge thickness. So let's set an edge thickness of 7. Now let's select this, Control D again, set an edge thickness of 5 on our new bevel, Control D, an edge thickness of 3, and Control D, an edge thickness of 1. Now with these done, let's hit Control A and let's just dial these back. So now we have these 5 alphas or bevels on our text. Now with the present settings, this is a rather subtle effect. So we can come in and increase our light intensity very, very small amounts. Now you might be looking at this and saying, well, this is still incredibly subtle. And that's essentially what we want out of a bevel filter, or this beveling effect. You'll notice the effect if you turn it off. We can see now that these bevels have a huge difference in our final look. But if you were looking at this, it wouldn't stand out as, oh, that text is beveled inside of After Effects using a simple filter. And that's really what you want to avoid when you're creating these kind of perspective tricks. We want to avoid having the light intensity so strong that it becomes obvious that we're using this bevel filter. Instead, we want to keep this at a very subtle effect, so let's say something like 0.07 as the maximum. It gives us a little bit of 3D, but it doesn't give us so much shading that it ruins our integration and makes it look unrealistic. So just to finish this off, let's give this a little bit of a noise because right now it's far too uniform. So let's right click here and let's go to our noise and grain and let's just add in a noise here. And let's just increase this noise quite a bit. Now we don't want color noise, so let's uncheck this, and that's going to be far too strong. So let's again make this subtle. So maybe something like 6 or 7%, just enough so that you don't notice it, but if it's not there, it's visible to the eye. So giving this kind of text just a very slight amount of noise will help sell it, because pretty much everything in the real world has a little bit of a texture to it. Something that smooth is obviously fake, but once we add in a little noise, it's going to be a little bit more believable. So I think we have our text pretty much finalized. Now the noise might cause some issues in our final render, and we'll sort of deal with that later, but for now I think our text looks pretty nice. So let's just Shift 0, RAM preview that back. Okay, it looks pretty good. Of course, let's RAM preview this at 100%. Now the noise is going to be randomly generated every single frame, so that might cause some issues, as I said earlier, but for now I'm pretty happy with this effect. It's pretty subtle, but without it you can definitely see the difference that we've added to our text here. So in the next lesson, let's come in and let's duplicate our text layer to create the shadows on the ground. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can duplicate our pre-comp of our text and then add a few quick effects to create our shadowing on the ground. So here's where we left off. I've just opened up 05 begin. So we have our text layer created nicely and moving with our scene. So to create the ground shadow for this, and again this works out primarily well in this shot because it has such a simple movement and the camera is looking pretty much directly at the ground, all we need to do is duplicate this text. So we now have a duplicate, and let's actually start to name these. So let's call the top one our main text, and let's call the bottom one our text shadows. Now with our text shadows, we don't need all these bevel alphas or this noise here. We essentially only need the fill. So let's go into our fill now, and let's set this to something dark. And we can actually sample from the actual shadows inside of our scene. So once you've sampled the shadows in our footage, let's now give this a blur effect. So we can actually delete these extra bevels and other effects. So now let's go into blur and sharpen, and let's give this a fast blur, and let's just give this a fast blur of something like 4. Now that's immediately going to give us some shadowing inside of our scene, but to make this real, we have to move our shadows according to where the light is. So the light is hitting this object here, and it's casting the shadows in a down left direction. So we now need to move our text shadows down and to the left. So let's hit left and down, maybe 3 or 4 times. So we just need to move this ever so slightly down and to the left to give this a nice effect. Now of course if your shadows were moving up and to the right, you'd need to move your shadows layer up and to the right. But for our case, down and to the left will give us some nice contact shadows with the ground. Now if you want to make these shadows softer, all we need to do is increase this blurriness, and the further away the shadows are from our letters, the softer they will be. Now if the shadows are very close, they would need to have a low amount of blurriness, and they would need to be pretty close to the text. So let's actually give this a slightly lower blurriness than what we had before. Let's move it a little bit closer to our shadows here. Remember to take an indication of the shadows around our object to find out what kind of shadows you have. So for example, if these text pieces are supposed to be about as big as these bricks or as tall, look at these shadows and see how they're being cast. We can see they're relatively sharp, so we may need to even decrease our fast blur down a little bit. But it is important that we have a fast blur, otherwise our shadows are going to look a little bit too fake. Now another thing with this shadowing layer is we don't want it at 100% opacity, because that would be just covering up our current layer with this text shadows. So what we can do is we can decrease its opacity a little bit, something like 86, and change it to a multiply blending mode. And again, you'll find this under our transfer controls. Now multiply darkens the layers beneath it based on how dark this layer is. So what that means is it'll pick up a little bit more detail from the ground than if we were using a normal blending mode. So let's get these shadows about correct. Now at the end of anything, we're going to have a little bit of a tweaking phase, or we'll take a look at the entire composition and see what tweaks we need to make. I actually want to increase these shadows just a little bit. Okay, so now we have the contact shadows, or you might call them the ground shadows, with our text. Now of course if the background or if the ground here was moving or was curved or shaped differently, you're going to need to come in and warp your text to match the ground. But again, since we chose such a nice shot for this sequence, our ground is relatively flat, so we really don't need to be or do too much modification to our shadows other than moving them slightly away from our text. Okay, so we have our ground contact shadows pretty much well done. So now we need to figure out how to integrate the original shadows from our background on top of our text. And to do that, we'll begin isolating these shadows using a Luma key in the next lesson. Now, in this lesson, just to reiterate really quickly, we duplicated our text layer, decreased its opacity, and added a fast blur, and then filled it in with a shadow color, and then we just moved it in the direction of the shadows to create our shadowing. Now, the great thing about pre-comping this text is we can now come in and change it. So if we had, let's say, a misspelling in Infiltrator or something, we needed to change the text, we would just need to change it inside of this pre-comp, and then it would dynamically update inside of our main comp. So remember that you should always pre-comp your text so that your text layer is inside of a composition, and I would really not apply movement or effects to the text layer itself, especially if you're going to be duplicating that text layer, because now we can simply modify a single text layer and have it update into our main composition. So let's now continue the process of coming in and integrating this title with our background footage. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how to use a Luma key to extract the shadow information out of our background. So here's where we left off when I've opened up 06 Begin. So let's grab our source footage now, and well, we could duplicate it, but first let's pre-comp it. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C, and I'm going to call this my background footage. And again, before I comp anything or duplicate any layer, I prefer not to duplicate the original. I prefer to duplicate a pre-comp. So this way, if we duplicate our background footage, select down here and hit Control-D, we now have a copy of the same composition. So if we went in here and we changed out the source footage, it would again update in both of these compositions. So let's duplicate our footage, and let's come in here, and I'm going to name this our shadows, and let's put this at the top and let's solo it. So now we're looking only at this shadows layer. So let's now add in our key. So go to Effect, Keying, and let's add in our Luma key. Now the first thing we want to do is change our key type to Key Out Brighter. And immediately that's going to remove our image. So now let's increase our threshold. And we see some of these shadows popping back into existence. Now since we're looking at a dark shadow on a black background, this is going to be a little difficult to see. So you can either change your background color, which you can do that by right-clicking and going to Composition Settings. Actually, you can do that by hitting Control-Alt-B, or Control-Shift-B, sorry, to bring up your background color picker, or go up to the Composition tab and go to Background Color. So let's set this at like a middle gray so we can see these black areas pop out a little bit easier. So let's keep increasing our threshold until we have most of our shadows inside of our person walking and this fence post here. Now once that's done, let's increase this tolerance a little bit to give it a slightly more definition here. And now let's just give it a slight edge feather, so something like 2 or 3 was probably a pretty good feather. And now we essentially have a layer of all the shadows inside of our scene. So if we unsolo this, what we're going to see is now our shadows are layered on top of our text and our text shadows. Now, of course, this is simple layering, so it's just A over B. So what we have is our shadow is completely eating away at our text, and we're also getting any contact shadow that was on the ground. So this shadow here from the rock and this shadow is now on top of our text. That would be useful if our text was integrated into the ground, but the illusion we're trying to sell is that our text is actually floating above our ground. So we're going to have to do a little bit more work than just having a simple luma key inside of our image. So we have the initial shadows created, and we can sort of previs how this is going to look. So at this point, if we need to move our text or anything else, we should do that now. So what I'm going to do is I want to move my main text up a little bit so it has a little bit more of this contact shadow. So to do that, we can go into the main text, and we can just move this text layer up a few clicks. So I'm just hitting the up key on my keyboard, and now if we go back into our main comp, we can see that our text is now updated. Now we could also, of course, select our main text and text shadows composition and move those as well. So now the shadow is covering up a pretty nice amount of our text here. Let's actually just move it up just a little bit closer. And of course, depending on your text, framing, and everything else, you're going to want to move your own text in a different manner. But I want to make sure that these shadows can cover up a nice volume of this top text here to make sure our audience gets the point that these shadows are being cast on our text. Okay, so now that we have our initial shadow layer, let's come in and let's begin creating some masks. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can use masks and our tracker data to extract out this fence here, which is what I call a static shadow. So we'll begin refining these shadows in the next lesson. So in this lesson, we duplicated our background footage, put it on top, and we used a luma keyer set to key out brighter to isolate the dark areas of our image. Now, of course, if you have a bright area you want to isolate, you can use the key out darker. And of course, if you have any other areas, you can use other keying techniques. But since we have shadows, the luma key is an ideal keyer to grab all of our shadow information. In this lesson, we're going to set out our static shadows, or our shadows that don't move too much, using our tracker and some masks. So here's where we left off, and we have shadows working, but they're working in areas we don't want them to. So now that we have our shadows working, we're going to need to come in and limit our shadows to areas that we want them on. So where the fence post has this shadow, we want that. But this grease stain here is not a shadow, so we don't want that on top of our letters. So to begin with, let's start masking out this shadow layer. Now there's a few problems that we run into. So one problem is if we create a mask on this shadow layer, we're going to have to animate it to be moving with this image here, or with our footage. And that can quickly cause problems. Now these shadows here are static, or they don't move by themselves. So we already have tracker data, and so we can apply this tracker data to a shadow to save us time. Now these shadows at the top of the person obviously move quite complex, so we're going to have to hand rotoscope those. So to get our tracking data and our shadows together in a nice package, I'm actually going to duplicate our tracking data and pre-comp our shadows together. And that way I can just focus in on these shadows without having to worry about the rest of these layers. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C, and let's call this our background shadows. And now let's go into this pre-comp here. So now we have our shadows and our tracking data. So what we can do now is we can create a composition that has our shadows mask on it and then connect that to our tracker. So to do this, let's hit Control-Y, or go to Layer, New, Solid. And it doesn't matter what really color this is, so let's just click OK. And let's hide this. And now we can draw a mask on this new layer. So just to kind of preview what we're going to do on our static shadow solid layer, and again, I'm just naming this so it's clear in my mind. Let's just draw a quick mask here. So let's say we're going to draw a mask around the tip of this railing shadow. So we'll just draw this out and finish it up. So now to combine these together so only this part of the shadow is seen, we can go to our shadows, and again with our transfer controls, let's set our track matte to an alpha matte. And now we see that only the areas inside of this solid are being kept. Now if we animate or we move forward, we can see that our shadows are not staying with it. So to animate our shadows, let's parent our static solid to our tracking data, and now if our tracking data is sound, our shadow will move correctly. So now we can come in and draw the rest of these shadows. So to view these a little bit easier, you can always duplicate your initial layer and make sure it has no track matte. And now we can simply come in and continue to draw out masks on this static shadow layer. So let's just grab our two pieces here and let's extend these out. Now if you want to learn more about rotoscoping and the pen tool, which is what we're going to be using in this course, feel free to watch our Introduction to Rotoscoping in After Effects, which goes into the pen tool in quite a lot of detail, as well as have a lot of tips and techniques for rotoscoping or doing this kind of work. For now, let's come in and with our pen tool selected, just continue drawing out these shapes we're going to need. Now if you want to make this a little bit faster, we can copy our text layer in here and only rotoscope out or create shapes for areas that cover our text. So let's come in here and let's copy our main text layer. So I'm just going to Control C, Control V, and this should copy it in the correct position. Let's double check here. So the O is right in the middle of this stain here, and it's in the correct place in our background shadows. Now if we want this to move correctly, we'll again need to connect it up to our tracking data. So now we can see exactly what areas we need to create masks over. So let's come in here and continue drawing out these masks. Now these masks of course don't need to be perfect, they just need to be relatively close to the shadows we're going for. And we can actually, if our shadows have enough space on the edges, just roto around the edges of the entire shadow instead of going in and creating a specific shape. Because again, we're only doing this to cut out areas that have improper shadows, such as this one right here. However, if there are no improper areas, we don't really need to be too specific while we come in and edit it. Okay, that's looking good. Let's take a look at this. Alright, so we can see here that we have a harsh layer on our shadows. To get rid of that, let's select our shadow layer and hit the F key to bring up our feather. Then we can select everything and give it, let's say, about a 2 pixel feather, which just softens the edges a little bit. Now when we do that, we may decrease the size of this mask a little too much, so we can come in and expand out our mask a little bit. So let's expand these masks out, maybe less than 1 pixel. Oh wait, maybe less than 4 pixels. Maybe 1 pixel will do us nice. And then we can come in and modify any masks that need to be modified. So as always, double check your work inside of the main composition to make sure that it's working correctly. Now this here is a little bit too soft for my tastes, and that might be actually a problem with our, let's see if it's a problem with our shadow or with our mask, or a problem with our Luma key. So I'm going to increase the size of this shadow here and see if that gets rid of it. And it's still there, so it's probably an issue with our Luma key. So we're going to need to increase our threshold a little bit to grab more of those shadows. Now the more you increase your threshold or your tolerance, the more tight or the more your masks are going to need to directly line up with the actual objects here. Because the more we increase that tolerance and the threshold, the more errors we're going to introduce into our key. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Alright, that's nicely thickened up. Okay, great. It still looks like the O here is getting cut off a little bit, so let's just move that out just a tiny bit here. And as you can see, creating these kind of masks is really a give and take with the keyer and our masks here. Okay, that's looking much nicer. So once we have our static shadows in place, and if we animate this through, we can see them working nicely. What we'll need to do now is we'll need to come in and we'll need to hand rotoscope this person here. Now you might be thinking that's going to be a really difficult challenge, but it's actually not going to be as difficult as we make it, or as we may think, because we only have to rotoscope the areas that cover up our letters here. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can use rotoscoping techniques to key out or create a cutout of our person's shadow. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at rotoscoping techniques to have our moving shadow be cut away from the errors that appear in our ground. So here's where we left off, and I've just opened up 08 begin, so we have our static shadow animated nicely. Now I noticed here at the end our masks get slightly off, and this is partially due to our tracking data. So to fix this, we can just set some mask keyframes on our static solid. So what we can do is we can set a position keyframe at the first frame where we set up these masks, and then let's set a new keyframe about halfway through. Let's just move this down just a tiny bit, and then at the end here where we have a very big offset, let's move this down even further. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get this matched up again with our layer here. So after just setting a few simple keyframes, we now have a much more accurate mask that actually stays with our solid. And that's going to give us, again, much more accurate shadows. Okay, so now let's take a look at where we need to keyframe or where we need to roto this person's shadow. And again, I'm going to show my text here. So we need to isolate the person. Let's see, we need to isolate his arm, or her, I guess, and the main body. And we need to do this beginning on, let's say, frame 32. So let's create a new solid here, and this will be our body roto solid. And again, we can hide this. And let's now create a shape. So I'm going to left bracket this to cut this to our current timeline. And let's set a shape where the arm is very easy to be seen. So right here, the arm is very visible. So let's draw a new shape around this arm here. And I'm going to draw it into the body. Now we don't, again, want this to be very tight. We just want it to be somewhat loose so that we can come out and sort of easily animate this. And again, if you want to learn more about the key or the pen tool, the Intro to Rotoscoping has a lot of information about the specifics of what I'm doing here. If you want to break the tangent, as you just saw, you just select it, hold Control, left click, and then hold Alt, and you can move these around individually. Okay, so on this frame, we have our hand initial shape created. So let's hit the M key to bring up our mask path, and let's hit the stopwatch to begin animating it. So let's animate it to the beginning of this time here. So to animate or do rotoscoping, we can move each point, but that's a bad habit. So what we want to do is we want to left double click on it and then move it or translate it and then rotate it to get the correct positioning. And this way, what we're going to get is much more accurate movement and no shape distortion to really speak of. So let's just come in here and let's animate this, and then let's see, we can jump forward probably about 5 frames, and I'm just hitting the page down key 5 times, and then again double left click it, move it into place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Double left click it, move it into place. Now it's hidden, so we can just hide it inside of the body. And again, this is just sort of quick and dirty rotoscoping. If you had a very long sequence or a very complex animation, you probably would want to sort of scrub through this and get the timing of this animation beforehand. But for our case, we can sort of just scrub through and get a rough movement of our arm here. And then we can just scrub back and take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now we just need to move it till it exits. Okay, now let's just take a look at this. And again, I'm just hitting page up and page down and sort of moving through this. And wherever it misses our text, I'm just going to animate this. And again, we're probably going to extend this out and give this a little bit of a feather. So we don't need it to be perfect, but we want it to be pretty close. Now when it's hidden, we don't really need to worry about it because our main body will worry about it then. And again, it's only really important over our text. So right here, this tip of the hand, it's not over text, so I couldn't really care about it. Okay, so let's actually rename this arm roto because it seems like we're going to be working on this a little bit more than I expected. But now what we can do is we can take this second shadow layer, and I'm just going to duplicate this again. We can call this our arm shadows, and we can track mat this onto our arm roto layer. So now we have our arm nicely placed over our text. Now, of course, some parts of this, the body is going to be taking care of it. But on our arm roto, let's hit F, and let's just give this a 2-pixel feather, just so we don't have any sharp edges. Now let's go back to our main comp, and we can see we now have our arm moving over our text. Now, of course, we need the rest of our body moving over to actually sell the effect, but as you can see, we're getting very close to finishing this off. Now we still have the issue of our shadow is on top of our text, but later on we'll take a look at how to create some alternative text for in the shadows and how to set that up. For now, in the next lesson, let's come in and let's create roto shapes for the body and then finish off our shadow rotoscoping. In this lesson, we're going to finish our shadows by rotoing out our body. So here's where we left off. Let's jump into our background shadows composition. And now let's, again, pretty much do the same thing we did last time. Let's go to our start time, hit Control-Y to build a new solid. And let's call this our body shadow, or our body roto. And again, let's hide it, and let's begin creating our shapes. So again, I'm going to go to an area where the body is highly visible. So probably somewhere around 53 here. And let's draw our initial shape. So I'll grab my pen tool, and let's just draw a rough shape, not getting too close to the edge, but just kind of skirting the outside. And again, we really only need to bother with these areas inside or covering our text. So up here, we can be more lazy. So with that initial shape drawn, let's hit M, and let's keyframe our mask path. And that's very important because otherwise we're just going to be making changes and not actually setting any shape keyframes. So now let's just go back a little bit in the time here, and let's double click and move our body shape back. And remember, we have our arm and our body shape, so if we select both of these, we actually can't see both these masks, but you can see they overlap quite a bit. So let's continue moving back in our timeline and just doing some animation on our roto shape. So again, we just want to move it and rotate it to match the movement of our body here. And then when it actually gets closer, we can come in and make some fine-tuning. Okay, let's animate towards the end now. So let's now come forward a few frames. Again, left double clicking. As you can see, rotoscoping is kind of a tedious task. It's really just hand moving shapes to match your moving objects. However, sometimes it is a necessary evil. So let's come in here and finish this off. And then, as you'll notice, I've kind of gotten a little sloppy with this, so we'll come back and edit these points here in a second now. So now let's go back to our keyframes and make sure that our points, whoops, let's Control Z if we accidentally move it. And now we can just jump in between keyframes and move our individual points to be slightly more correct. Okay. And again, we cover a lot of this in Intro to Rotoscoping in After Effects. Okay, so this is looking pretty good, and then, so let's again give this a 2-pixel feather and connect our shadows up to its alpha. So now we can see the translation of this. So let's just hit spacebar and take a look. And again, we're only worried about areas that are over text. So it looks like we have a few difficult frames here. Starting on frame 47, see our arm here is a little bit too high, so we're starting to show some areas we don't want to. So let's just move that down. Jump forward a frame, and we have the same issue. So now is the time when we're going to actually come in and start to really hand animate this part. And we're going to have to switch between both our body and our arm, because both of these are controlling how our shadows are moving. So let's hit U on both of these to make sure we have keyframes here. Let's hit U again and look for another bad area. And you'll be able to see them whenever these strange things pop out. But again, if we have pop-outs here, or areas we don't want to show that is not over the text, we don't have to worry about them. And this is, again, only if we have a very specific area for our text. If the text area is kind of in the air, or we don't know where it's going to be, then we need to be a little bit more specific in our masking. Okay, so it looks like this is also part of the arm here. So as you can see, we're going to do a little bit of manual tweaking to get this working. Okay, so let's do a RAM preview of this inside of our main composition to take a look and see if we can spot anything. So I'm just going to increase the size here so I can see this text. Alright, I'm not noticing any popping. So we'll just let this RAM preview, and then we'll play this back to take a look at our shadows. Okay, I don't really see anything. Now again, I'm looking up here, and I'm looking in this text. Now there's a weird shadow going on here, but that's just this grass, and there's not really much we can do about it. I guess we could roto it out if we really felt that strongly about it, but for our case, I'm just looking at these shadows going over our text. Okay, it looks good. So spend as much time as you need rotoscoping these out. As you can see, I added quite a few keyframes, and of course the number of keyframes you add depends on how complex your shape is going to be and how much it moves. And of course this is also very dependent on where your text is and what your text says, because we really don't have to worry about anywhere that's not on our text. So depending on your placement, this may be more complex, or it may have been a much more simple roto job. So just to clean this up, let's hide our main text here so we just have these shadows. Let's hide this. So now we have all of our shadows now integrated over our text. So now in this next lesson, let's come in and let's create a new text layer that will appear inside of our shadows, and see how we can use our shadows now to correctly integrate our shadows and this new text layer we're going to create in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to track mat our text layers into our cutout alpha, and then we're going to create a shadow text layer so that we can actually see the text inside of our shadows. Then we'll clean up our scene a little bit. So here's where we left off. I've just opened up 10 begin. And so here we see our shadows are correct, but we don't see any text beneath them. And that's because the shadows are essentially just covering up our text. So of course what we could do is we could use a blending mode on our shadows, such as multiply, but that would darken up our normal shadows beyond what it normally would be. So what let's do instead is let's create a new main text, or let's create a new shadow text that conforms to our shadows. So I'm going to duplicate my main text here, and let's bring this up, and we can call this our text, or our shadow text. Alright. So now what we can do is we can alpha track mat this into our background shadows. And now our shadow text is only going to be visible here. However, it's a little bit difficult to see, so let's press F3, and let's jump over to our fill here, and let's darken this up a bit. So I'm just going to drag down this brightness slider. So now we can see the effect of our two different text layers. So on top here we have our shadow text, and then on the bottom we have our main text. Now we're getting a little bit of a haloing around our shadow, and that's because our main text is still underneath it. So let's now duplicate our background shadows to delete our main text. So I'm going to hit Control D, drag my new background shadows above my main text, and now instead of an alpha matte, let's do an alpha inverted. And that will cut out this layer wherever our background shadows are. Now we actually have one more concern, and this is, honestly, it's so difficult to see, it's almost not worth doing, but if you're super hyper-focused and looking very closely, you'll notice we have a shadow within our shadow, because our text shadows are still being displayed. So we also want to track matte our text shadows layers as well. Now just to make this easier, I'm going to grab my main text and my text shadows, and I'm going to pre-comp these together. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C, call these my text with shadows. And now, for this one layer, we can reparent it to our tracking data, and then we can use an alpha inverted matte to connect both our text and our text with shadows layer into our background shadows. So now if we look, we're correctly not getting any new shadows. Now the shadow text is still a little bit strong, so I'm going to hit Control-A and then dial these down. And the bevel effect is really sort of ruining the visibility or the believability of this, so let's just turn off a couple of these. So by turning off a couple of these bevels, we've left still a very small bevel effect. However, it's so subtle, and we can actually come into these bevels and turn them down as well. So let's pull this light back to something like 0.3 or 0.4, just to give this a very slight beveling effect, but much less than our normal text. Now we might also want to reduce this noise a little bit. So let's pull this noise back to about, let's say, 5 or 6%. Okay, that looks good. Now depending on your background, you can of course change this color or even just sample a shadow color to get this correct. And now we actually have our text inside of our shadowed areas. And because we left a little bit of a bevel on it, it still maintains its 3D appearance. So this is kind of a nice way of faking shadows. We really don't have any light interaction. We just duplicated our text layer, made it much darker than our current layer, and then had it only appear wherever our shadows appear. Okay, great. And we also came in and combined our text and shadows layer and then alpha matted those away so that we wouldn't be casting a double shadow into our scene. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at color correcting our background plate and making any last tweaks we want to make, and then we can render out our final integrated title. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at color correcting our background for increased contrast, and then we'll take a look at any other changes we need to make. So here we are back in After Effects, and I've just opened up 11_begin, and let's just grab our background footage layer and let's do a little bit of color correcting. So if we go to Effect, Color Correction, let's begin by dropping on levels to sort of get those balanced. As we can see here, our levels are rather unbalanced with our entire image in the dark gray spectrum. Now, depending on your uses and, of course, your artistic intent, you may want your background this dark, but I would rather have it a little bit more balanced. So I'm going to pull these back a little bit. Now that makes our text look a little off, so what we can do is we can come into our text now and darken that up or brighten it up. And we'll need to go into our text with shadows pre-comp. And what we need to do is we need to have our main text effects, but we want to look at them in the main comp. So what we can do is we can lock our effects control panel, and now we can change this fill inside of our main comp. So we might want to make this a little bit brighter, or you might experiment with an actually darker version of the text. So we can see here. While experimenting with this project, I've also found that the brick color gives us another nice look if we make it dark enough. So, of course, depending on your style, you can, of course, change this. I'm actually going to go back to a slightly brighter area. So let me just sample a little bit of this backdrop here. And as you'll notice, I'm actually sampling it from the actual composition when I was inside of that mask. So all we need to do is exit out. Okay. So it's going to be a little bit more subtle, but we can always come back to our background footage and unlock our effects controls and sort of dial this back a little bit so we maintain that contrast between our title and our backdrop. Now, let's see if we actually have this color correction in here. Nope, that was actually a CS5 thing when they added in vibrance, so we could add in a little bit of a saturation boost with the hue saturation, but as always it's very easy to overdo this, so we just want a very, very slight boost, almost so subtle you'll barely even be able to see it. Okay, so now that we've changed our background, let's take a look here. Our shadows might be off. You can see our shadow text is a little bit too dark. So what we can do is grab our shadow text and again, pick a color from inside of our shadowed area. And when in doubt, we can always jump in and edit that. Okay, so let's zoom out and take a look. All right, so that's pretty readable. And then our shadow goes over it nicely. Okay, great. So let me give myself a little bit of screen real estate and then do a nice RAM preview to see what this is looking like. So I'm going to hit the 0 key and let me just pause the video while this RAM preview's in. All right, here we are. Now we can see the final result of our integrating title. Now we still have a very tiny perspective shift, and at the beginning I did say we were going to deal with this, but I've looked over a couple techniques to dealing with this perspective shift and faking it, and while it works maybe 1 out of every 5 times, it's a very random chance if we get it right. So the perspective shift in this is so subtle we can barely see it, so I think I'm just going to live with it because by the time our audience is done reading this, their eyes should be moving with the shadow now, and of course this is jumping into possibly a cut inside of our final sequence. So now that we have all of our effects set up, we can of course come in and change our text if we need to. Of course, hopefully we don't need to. And let's actually organize our project just a tiny bit. So let's see, compositions, do not edit. So our background shadows, background footage, all of our solids, or our text with shadows, we don't want to edit. And let's just dump all of our footage into a footage folder. So that's our solids, our source text, and our text. So really we only want to be able to look at the main comp, which is also the render comp, and the text layer if we need to come in and change this up. So for example, if we need to say something else, let's say my custom title here. As soon as we update that, you can see that everything is updated inside of our final comp, including the shadows and all of the interaction. So as you can see, pre-comping your text is an incredibly powerful way to keep your composition flexible even to the very last minute. And if we build something like integrating this title correctly, we can integrate almost any title and it will instantly update. So that brings us to the end of this course, and as always, I hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions about anything we've covered here, feel free to join our forums where we have a very helpful community and where we ourselves are often participating in the questions and answers. So I can't wait to see how you use this technique in your own projects.